Hello everyone and welcome back to our next installment of Unpack It. We are going to kick into things and it is my absolute pleasure to now introduce our presenters for today's session. And first up, we will have our guest speaker, Jane Paramore, the Sustainability Manager at APCO. So having commenced her career delivering analytical market research tools and services to the consumer packaged goods industry globally, Jane has worked with some of the world's largest retailers and manufacturers on everything from new product development to category management, loyalty programs to shopper insights, and through to strategic store layout design. Jane developed a deep understanding of the packaged goods sector and the challenges presented by a constantly shifting shopper landscape. Working on a diverse range of sustainability topics over more than a decade, Jane's recent focus has been plastic waste and pollution and the impact that it's having on the environment and the health of the world's oceans. Jane's FMCG experience provides a solid foundation in consumer products and packaging, over which she applies the sustainability lens, bringing the two sides together to support APCO's work of delivering on the 2025 national packaging targets. Next on our panel today, we have our host, Brad Jevons, and Brad is the Business Improvement Manager for Signet. Brad is an organisational improvement leader and author whose purpose is helping to share knowledge and create a better future economically, environmentally, and socially for generations to come. Brad is the host of the Enterprise Excellence podcast, which shares knowledge weekly from our world's leading experts on improving organisations to create a better future. Brad has extensive experience within the packaging industry and helps organisations large and small achieve sustainable improvement. Welcome to our webinar today, Jane and Brad.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Prue.
Thanks, no worries at all. I'm going to hand over now so we can kick straight into it.
Thanks. Jane, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you all our attendees too. Hopefully you gain some good knowledge. I'm sure you will. We've got amazing questions to cover. Like today, we're going to cover everyone. We're going to explore the top 5 questions that we've gathered from the Australian industry, and APCO's done this. And these are the main questions they get coming through in relation to sustainable packaging. And the 5 questions are: how to define and verify recycled content in packaging. That's going to be the first question we cover. The second one's going to be how to use the Australian recycling label, which is often termed the ARL. We're going to look at what is considered single-use plastic, and we're going to go through some of the differences around the country with different legislation and regulations, and also provide some good news for the future in this regards to trying to keep track of this. We're going to look at how to design recycled packaging, so explore that recycled side. And then we're going to go into compostable. And we're going to look at compostable packaging in relation to what is it, how does it behave, and where should we use it? So some good topics we'll cover here. Following this, Jane's going to kindly provide us her top 3 insights into innovations that are occurring in Australia right now in relation to sustainable packaging. So I'm really looking forward to this. But Jane, before we get into the first question, do you mind just giving us a little bit of information about APCO? Like, who is APCO and what are they trying to achieve?
Of course, Brad, and hi, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many of you on the line today, and it's a real pleasure from our perspective to be here talking to you all. APCO, the acronym itself is the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation. So we're an administrative body that is established under a piece of regulation that exists at both the Commonwealth level and across state and territory jurisdictions. At the Commonwealth level, it's known as the National Environment Protection Measure for Used Packaging Materials. So it's as specific as that, and it outlines obligations around reporting and improvements towards packaging sustainability within the regulatory framework. It also creates what's known as the Australian Packaging Covenant, Brad, which is it's a document that is effectively a voluntary product stewardship agreement between government and industry to drive those objectives that are outlined underneath the National Environment Protection Measure. So we as an organisation are effectively the secretariat body that administers that voluntary product stewardship scheme, and we support our members to not only deliver their compliance obligations against the regulations, but also to provide them with the background and support that they need in terms of taking on that packaging sustainability journey. So yeah, a couple of roles there that we play as an organisation, and yeah, very much focused in improving this space as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jane. Like, I know from so many people I know, and I'm sure our attendees of the webinar too, packaging and the pollution it can cause and the positives and negatives of it are a hot topic. And APCO is playing a massive role in helping us achieve better outcomes for the future. So thanks, Jane. Let's get into this, everyone. So we've got some good questions that should really help here. So Jane, the first question that's come from Aussie businesses is, how do you define and verify recycled content in packaging?
Yeah, Brad, this is one of the big challenges. I think if we think about the national packaging targets that we're all working towards, we're looking to increase recycling of materials, but also to raise the levels of recycled content being used in packaging materials. One of the things that we really started to uncover as we began this journey, I guess probably 3 or 4 years ago, when that perfect storm happened around packaging and pollution, marine pollution, we really started to understand that actual verification of recycled content was a bit of a challenge. There was no real framework out there, not globally or locally, that really allowed us to do that. So at this point in time, where people are using the reference to recycled content in their packaging, there is an obligation that they are able to provide a clear chain of material flow to be able to validate those claims, and that's the sort of stuff that's crystallized underneath the ACCC regulations around green marketing. What we've been working on over the last couple of years is actually how we can create a system here in Australia that allows us to track and manage that material in such a way that we can verify those claims. So at the moment, there are a couple of international companies that are doing this, private companies that are doing this. We are looking to understand how best that we can apply that sort of model here in the Australian marketplace generally, so that everybody has access to that as part of the framework. We're in the process of finalising a report at the moment as to what that might look like, and we're hoping to actually produce a label and a framework for validation early next year. So it's coming soon, but it's one of those things that I think really has been a very clear objective, but it's also highlighted some of the deficiencies we have in being able to do that at the moment. But hopefully we're working pretty keenly to close that gap up.
Oh, Jane, that would be a massive step forward. Like, I hear a lot that people are confused a bit in this space, and that type of data on a specified certified label within Australia would really clear a lot of that up, which I guess moves us. Yeah, just because it's knowledge is what people need, isn't it? And trust in that knowledge, which moves us on to the next question, which is really, Australian businesses. How do Australian businesses use the Australian recycling label, which I know has been a big drive for APCO and Planet Ark in relation to how do we give people that knowledge and that power to be able to do the right thing?
Well, again, Brad, I think this is probably a product of what happened 3 or 4 years ago. We'd been sending a lot of our materials offshore for processing. We didn't have the capacity in this country to deal with those materials locally. When we suddenly had to look internally and understand exactly what was coming through our system, we realized that there was an awful lot of contamination going through the waste stream from packaging sources. So what the main objective there was to try and actually improve what was coming into the recovery systems from the consumer point of contact, I guess. And the Australasian Recycling Label, it allows us to do that by giving consumers the correct information at the point of disposal, so that what we end up with in that yellow bin, that commingled recycling bin, is actually materials that are desirable, that have end markets, and that will end up being recycled. Otherwise, we just end up with a lot of mixed materials that are often downgraded for use or will end up in landfill. So the label allows us to provide that correct disposal information. Interestingly, at the other end of the cycle, it's also having an impact on the design for materials going into the system, because people are trying to ensure that their materials are either recyclable, reusable or compostable, according to that national packaging target of 100% that we're aiming for there. And if things are going through the system and coming out with non-recyclable labels on them, it's having quite an impact on the way that they're looking at the design of their packaging. So it's driving it at both ends of the spectrum there, I think. So that was kind of an unexpected outcome that we really started to notice over the last couple of years, that people are using it for that purpose as well. But it's really about trying to, I guess, give that clear information, eliminate that contamination. And I think the endorsement of the government in the National Plastics Plan recently, that 80% of supermarket products have to have the ARL by the end of 2023, is a very strong endorsement that it's an effective program. So yeah, we're seeing that rolling out much faster.
It's powerful, Jane. I'm in I'm in middle Queensland. I'm in a place near Bundaberg, so I'm not in
Mhm.
lockdown at the moment. But I was with a friend, and we're talking about the ARL label, and he was like, "Oh, what is that, Brad?" And I picked up a bottle of Fountain Sauce. So good on your Fountain. And I was able to just show him. He's like, "Oh, that's easy."
Yeah.
But Jane, what can business? Is there some things businesses can do to help promote the ARLs more and actually get that message out there more? Because I know APCO does a
Yeah.
lot of promotional work, but
Yeah, absolutely. But we've got a whole set of intermediary kits there for people to use to actually promote the label itself. We've got logos and graphics and things that can be incorporated into communication. So if businesses are looking to use the label, joining APCO is the way to get access to it. And then you have access also to all those collateral, marketing collateral and communications collateral that we put together for that purpose. Yeah, absolutely.
That makes it easy, doesn't it? Because I can imagine every company that's getting on this journey to really help the planet, probably one of the best things you can do is put the ARL logo on your product and then promote the life out of it, because it's a good thing for your consumers and a good thing for you, isn't it, as a business also?
Consumers are looking for it. That's one of the things we do an insights report every year, just to understand what the uptake on the label has been. And we've just seen in this last 12 months that it's just shot through the roof in terms of people being aware of it for a start and looking for it. And actually it's starting to drive choices in terms of what people are picking off the shelf if they can see that label in front of them. So it is having quite a dramatic impact on behaviour change from that perspective.
Yeah, brilliant. I've got to put a call out to yourselves and also Planet Ark. Like the quality of that logo is so simple to understand. Like you do not have to think too much to look at the product and go, okay, I know what I need to do with the lid, the bottle, with whatever might be there. It's great.
I have to say,
Jane.
actually, it's a point of pride. We were called out by the United Nations Environment Programme last year as one of 2 exemplary labelling programs for consumers around the world. And it's partly the simplicity of that label, but it's also the technology underpinning it that I think we're going to talk a little bit about as we go through this afternoon. But the 2-pronged part of that labelling system is actually what makes it very, very much an exemplary model.
You absolutely deserve it, Jane. I had Katie Wellen, who's an expert in circular economy in Sweden. She's Scandinavian and runs a big podcast there. And she was talking about how well Australia's going and the ARL logos and all this happening. And I was like, yeah, there's some
very
good stuff
exciting.
happening. So well done. And that moves us on to another topic that I know that APCO is actually starting to do some work on also, which is some of the confusing elements around single-use plastics and the different regulations and legislations around the country, and businesses really trying to understand, well, what is a single-use plastic? How do I navigate this? What can be done to make it clearer for Australians?
That's another interesting space that we've been dabbling in over the last couple of years. I think a lot of the confusion is around the difference between a single-use plastic, which is the sort of thing that we see in terms of straws and cutlery and food service packaging, those sorts of things which are regarded under that kind of banner. Plastic shopping bags, disposable coffee cups, they're the sorts of things that usually fall into those sorts of categories. And when we're seeing government regulation being put into place, it's focusing predominantly on those sorts of materials. So they're the things that are being banned or phased out or being earmarked for alternative materials to be introduced into the system. Where we focus is into some of the more complex issues around things like packaging materials that are being used in single-use applications that are problematic or unnecessary. So we did some work last year and released an action plan in December that takes you through that process of understanding, firstly, whether it's problematic in terms of material usage that's going into the packaging. So we're seeing things like polystyrene being phased out. We're seeing things like PVC being phased out, whether we can get that out of the packaging materials that people are using, and also what's unnecessary. So we're looking at rationalization and optimization of packaging to minimize the amount of material that is being used in the first place. So the way that we're focusing on this from a packaging perspective is to try and actually, I guess, smooth that out so that we've got the most optimized, most recyclable materials in the system again, and we're getting rid of some of those things that are causing challenges in that processing pathway.
Yeah, that's powerful, Jane. You and I both know Jason Good, and I met with Jason a lot of years ago, and Jason said to me, Brad, one of the biggest challenges is just the complexity and the types of materials we use for packaging, particularly plastics.
Yeah. That's it, absolutely, Brad. And actually, we kind of, if you look at our strategy document that we put together a couple of years ago, the Our Packaging Future, we identified that there were 3 key areas that we needed to focus on. One of them was what was coming into the system. And again, if we can achieve that 100% recyclable, reusable, compostable target by 2025, all the other targets fall out from underneath that. If everything that's going into the system in the first place is one of those, then everything else will be able to follow on from there. So that design element's a huge part of that process and making sure that we're putting the right things in the first place.
Yeah. So it sounds like an action that Australian businesses can take is really to look at that document and really understand, how do I get some of the complexity out of the packaging that we're using? You know, especially if we're using polystyrene or PVC in some of our packaging, they're a clear winner right now to just get that complexity out of there.
Yeah, and you know, we're seeing government focusing on this a lot more as well. Again, the plastics plan has been quite explicit in trying to drive this agenda forward, and they're very keen on voluntary action from businesses and industry sectors coming together to try and address these challenges. But they're quite clearly signalling that they will consider regulation around this stuff if we don't do it ourselves. So there's a big motivation there for us to actually take those challenges on now and get moving on them.
Yeah, Jane, I had Ken Webster, who's on my podcast a while ago, and Ken is one of the leaders globally in circular economy, worked with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Ken said that he feels it's going to be one in the private sector. Like that's where he believes it can be mostly achieved, is through the private sector taking the right decisions and doing the right things, which I thought was a powerful statement, because through the few, you can create outcomes with the many, can't you?
I totally agree. And it's kind of the approach that we take. We have this collective impact approach that we try and bring, you know, the whole packaging value chain together so that we can understand, and we do it often at a sectoral level. I do a lot of work in sectoral-based projects, trying to actually understand what all the challenges are around the circle in order to make that circular economy a reality, and trying to work together to plug those gaps and fill those holes and understand what those nuances are. And it's really powerful, because when you have all the players at the table and they hear each other's perspectives and they start to think laterally and, you know, tangentially, and you start to get all these amazing ideas come out, and solutions just find themselves. It's a really powerful space to be in. It's really, I love it. It's, you know, I'm talking my favorite subject when I'm talking this stuff. So when we're in those sorts of groups, it's just like, oh, this is what we want to see. So yeah, it's really, doing it.
Well, and it's all falling together a fair bit, you know, our conversation, because it's about, okay, we've got the ARL logo, or the Australian Recycling Label logo we can use now. We can market and promote that and really help to get the word out as businesses. We can choose the right materials in our packaging to make the circularity happen in the most effective ways. That moves on to our next question, which is probably really key, is, you know, many Australian businesses do look to design their own recycled packaging and do the right thing, but, you know, they do face some barriers. What can businesses do when they hit roadblocks to overcome them and keep moving forward?
Again, I think that's a really big role that we play in supporting businesses in this journey. I can see on the slide there in front of us that we're talking about the PREP tool a little. The PREP tool is a really powerful tool from the perspective that it gives you a portal where you can go in, put in all the information about your packaging. It looks at things like base materials, it looks at attachments, it looks at labels, adhesives, it looks at inks, all those sorts of things, all those components that go into whether a packaging material can be recyclable. The powerful part about it is that it is not based on technical recyclability. It's actually based on real recyclability, based on end markets where we can sell the materials into, and based on our capacity in the country to be able to recover that material. So aside from the materials themselves, it's also looking at what happens at the other end of the pipe. So when we say it's recyclable, we are confident that all those pieces fit into place. And when you get that nice little sort of Mobius loop logo coming out at the end, there's confidence that it will end up where it should be. So the PREP tool allows you to, I guess, tweak your packaging design from the perspective of understanding how it's going to fare at end of life. And, you know, we've got companies that have things like no bin policies internally. So if they put something through PREP, it takes them back to the starting point and they reconsider the whole design again if they get that bin logo coming out. So it's really driving, again, as I was saying, at that end, that then feeds into the ARL to provide the correct instructions for consumers at the end of the pipe as to what to do with the material. So it's kind of a double-ended approach to improving the composition and design.
Brilliant. Oh, that's awesome. So for businesses who are going, right, what do I do? How do I go about this? It's really the PREP tool's there to just make it easy for them. You know,
yeah,
go in
absolutely.
there, put your data in, and, you know, you'll have the right insights to move forward with.
And there's a bunch of other resources in there as well. You know, we have a set of sustainable packaging guidelines. There are 10 key principles that underpin those guidelines. So working through, you know, we always say to people the first thing to do is always just step back and look at your own packaging, look at all the things that you're putting into the market at the moment and see how they fare against those guidelines. And then you can start to understand where you might need to make changes. And the prep tool can help you in that process of putting those changes into the system and understanding what the impacts of that might be on the other end. So yeah, it's kind of a whole sort of process that businesses can go through.
Oh, neat. Thanks, Jane. Jane, that moves us on to another topic that is really a hot topic at the moment. It's probably the one that I get spoken to most about is compostable packaging. And everyone's really gunning for it. There's a lot of momentum going forward towards compostable. But do you mind us chatting about that a bit? Like, you know, what is compostable packaging? How does it behave? And when should it be used?
Yeah, Brad, there's a lot of discussion around this at the moment. As you say, it's been a bit of an it material for a little while. People have seen it as a bit of a saving pathway. There are challenges with it. Of course, when we say something is compostable and it is certified as such, it means it must go into a composting system to be processed. So it doesn't mean that if it goes out into the environment, it's actually more likely to break down. It doesn't. It still has to go through a reprocessing system to be effectively processed through. Subsequently, we have challenges around that in Australia. We haven't got a lot of organic waste processing capacity in this country at the moment. It is starting to change. We're hearing, you know, Queensland has announced that they're putting together a stakeholder a policy roadmap for organic waste collection across the state. Victoria's got a mandate that all local governments should have organic by the end of 2023, I think it is. New South Wales has stated a similar objective. So I think it's starting to change in terms of that capacity, but it's going to take time for that to build up. In the interim, the only real pathway for using compostable packaging we see is where it is actually aiding in the capture of organic or food waste. And this is one of the big challenges. We need to get food waste out of our landfills because that's contributing, they suspect, around 50% of our methane emissions are coming from organic waste in landfill. Wow. So we need to get that out of the system, and compostable food packaging can help with that because you don't have the issues of, you know, plastics ending up in organic streams and likewise food ending up in recycling streams. So it allows us to create a pathway for that food waste that is very suitable. We're seeing a lot of people putting it into applications that aren't particularly good because it doesn't have a pathway to composting. So things like mailer bags. I know Australia Post for a while went down the pathway of looking at compostable bags, realised that in actual fact, most households don't have access to either organic waste or to a home composting system. No. So in actual fact, it was more likely to be ending up in landfill. So they've subsequently turned around and looked at that pathway and chosen to go with recycled soft plastics, which are compliant with the Red Cycle soft plastics program that exists around Australia. So that's been a better application and choice of materials there because we have infrastructure to capture that material. It can be processed and we know that it has an end pathway, whereas the compostables, unfortunately, are more likely to end up in landfill because they don't have a current pathway easily accessible. So that's one of the big challenges that we face, really. Sorry.
It's an interesting topic too, Jane, that you mentioned, like methane, because a lot of the topics around media become about carbon, isn't it? But carbon isn't the only element that can cause greenhouse outcomes. So, and methane's a big one, isn't it?
Far more potent than carbon dioxide. It's one of the highest potency greenhouse gases that we've got out there. So putting it through a composting system actually captures that in the compost, and it doesn't escape into the environment in the same way that it does when it's breaking down in a landfill environment, which is not, it's just really rotting rather than actually composting into something useful.
Yeah, my wife and I, Jane, we learnt the hard way about industrial composting products versus home composting too. So we live on acreage and we have Bokashi composting systems, and when it first happened, we put all the stuff that said compostable, we put in there, and you know, years later the plastic bags are still sitting there in our garden. So
I have some poor defenseless worms in my worm farm out in the garden there that I do the same sorts of experiments on just to see how they go. And again, it's about that process. Ultimately, that just, I think, demonstrates that these materials don't easily break down in normal environmental conditions, and you really have to have them in that composting system where it reaches the heat and the temperature, and it has the right, you know, bioorganisms and things in there to do the job. Whereas just out in the natural environment, in places like that, or in landfill, it's just not going to break down in the same way. So
yeah, that's brilliant insights.
So we've just put out a national strategy around compostable packaging. So if anybody's interested in having a look at that, I think Prue's got the link for that, and we'll share it with the group. But it's up on the APCO website if anybody's interested in reading a little bit more about that. Yeah, it's good stuff, but when it's applied in the right place.
Jane, do you mind giving one example of what might be a right place for it? Like, is there a place that it is working at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there's more uptake in, harking back to my previous life before I joined APCO, I worked for an organisation called Boomerang Alliance, and we established a program called Plastic Free Places. And the Plastic Free Places is a really nice model whereby they actually work in local small communities, and they will work with all the food service businesses around the area, and they will work to transfer their material usage across to compostables. And then they subsequently underpin that with a collection and recovery service. So they'll build a relationship with a local composter. They have an understanding of materials coming into the system. That's another issue. Composters in this country don't like compostables that aren't certified to Australian standards. We actually have the highest standards in the world in Australia because we have something called a worm toxicity test. And a lot of other jurisdictions that certify these materials are also looking to incorporate that into standards. But we've got it, and our composters really don't want things that aren't certified up to that level. So we also have a bit of resistance there, but where we can actually guarantee that we're putting Australian certified materials into the system, composters are happy to receive them, and then people like Plastic Free Places are setting up these arrangements with the businesses to capture that material, take it to the composter, and then it is processed correctly. So we're seeing a lot of that movement in things like venues, big venues, so entertainment centres and sporting grounds and these sorts of, I guess, kind of closed environments where you can capture that material effectively. Food markets, I've got a friend who runs the bigger New South Wales food market, and she has exactly that sort of relationship set up, and has all her bins in place, and all her vendors use the right materials, and they capture it all, and they divert that off to the right place. So it's kind of where you can control it in that sort of situation, that it's a perfect use for it, because it does capture all that food waste as well, which is a huge bonus.
So the key, Jane, is where you can have that controlled loop. You can send it out, collect it, and get it back. The one I'm hoping to see soon, there's been a lot of word on it, but is one of the big meat companies doing this with the retailers for their plastics, you know, the contaminated plastics. I'd love to see something happen there, because there's a lot of volume of plastics going to landfill currently through those linear supply chains, and I think that would be an amazing one if we could actually make that happen.
There's some really interesting stuff going on at the moment, Brad, around product stewardship. The National Product Stewardship Investment Fund funded about 25 projects over the last 12 months to run over the next few years. And there's a lot of, I think, consolidation that can be made with a lot of those projects that are bringing together materials that are challenging. And that's the reason that they're building systems outside of the conventional household collection systems and things like that. And I think that's actually setting up some great pathways for some of these more challenging materials that businesses and packaging manufacturers will be able to facilitate those sorts of arrangements much more easily as we go forward. So,
because there's some really, and there is many controlled closed loop examples where you can control the whole thing, especially with the sheer volumes that come from a lot of supply chains. You know, there's some massive volumes in packaging go through. So no, it's good.
And there are so many reverse logistics opportunities, I think, as well. And I think this is actually, we're starting to see this with reuse models. People are starting to look into that space as well at the moment around, you know, how can they, if they're going to invest in quality packaging materials, why don't they invest in something that's durable as well and build the model around it to actually capture it and not even go through that recycling process, just go through the, you know, cleaning, sanitization and put it back in service like we used to with our milk bottles. That same sort of idea is starting to emerge again. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, well, we should note that, isn't there, Jane, that there's 3 R's in the basic concept of promotion for the circular economy, isn't there?
Yeah, reduce, reuse, recycle. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, reduce and reuse sit above recycle because they are the the more sustainable of the options, and then we look at recycling for those materials that we need to put through the system again and bring back to raw materials. So yeah, key areas to focus on, really.
Yeah, it's like the slip, swap, slap campaign of the circular economy movement, the 3 Rs.
Yeah.
Look into it more, listeners, if you want to. It's really simple, and there's some great data out there. So Jane, there's some amazing insights. Thank you so much. And I know that I've gained from it. I'm sure our listeners have gained from it also. Do you mind now, Jane, if we pick your brain on the top 3 sustainable innovations that you're seeing happening around Australia at the minute when it comes to packaging?
Yeah, sure, Brad. Look, I think I was having a think about this, and there are some innovations that are fantastic and very exciting, and I think that's probably, we touched on a moment ago, the reuse side of things is one of the areas that we're really starting to see huge growth. You know, there are companies like TerraCycle are rolling out programs like their Loop program, which is focused on the consumer products market at the moment, and you know, building that kind of old milkman sort of model whereby you can order, have this beautiful durable packaging that's appearing delivered to your door. When you finish with your product, you send it back, it goes through a cleaning cycle and is returned to manufacturers for reuse again. And aside from seeing the environmental benefits associated with that, we're seeing amazing I guess investment in the packaging that businesses are choosing to use. Some of the design and, you know, the tactile sort of nature of these packaging items, it's taking packaging into a whole new world. It's just, it's actually becoming the sort of thing that you want to have sitting on your shelf in the bathroom or in the kitchen or around the house, because they actually look really beautiful. So I think, again, that's having another impact on the way people are designing their packaging as well. We're seeing a lot of different models coming out around that as well. You know, we've got examples of household packaging, household product companies putting marine plastics, recovered plastics into their bottles, and then using recyclable and recycled plastics to create their pouches to send out their refills and things like that. We're seeing in-store models that are existing where people can come in and bring, you know, refillable containers in and do it at the station in the store. There's all sorts of different stuff emerging around this, and I think, interestingly, it's moving into that kind of non-perishable consumer goods areas, but I think it's also starting to emerge into the food side of things as well. I think we're starting to see more and more of that happening too. I think there's been a lot of creativity as well around things like, you know, we talk a lot about pouches as being a very optimized format for manufacturers to use to, you know, good volumes of packaging can be used, and the barrier properties and things like that are fantastic. There's been a rationalization, I think, in that space over the last couple of years, because I think people have understood the complexities. Again, we talk about complexities of materials. The early pouches were very complex. They had multi-layered materials in them, laminates and things that not easily separatable and not really recyclable because they were such a mixed bag. Those sorts of developments are coming down to mono-material packaging, and we're now even seeing advents of schemes like the Roll and Recycle program, which are instructing consumers to roll their pouches into a form like a tube, and it comes with a little sticky label that holds it in place, and you can then put it through your normal curbside recycling rather than having to take it back to the supermarket with your soft plastics recycling. So again, trying to make that convenience for the consumer in terms of disposal of packaging is a really high priority. I think a lot of businesses are really looking into that space to improve those outcomes, because ultimately, you know, we hear a lot of talk about moving away from plastic, but ultimately plastic is incredible. It's a remarkable material for the things that we use it for. Certainly, you know, there are areas that we can design things out that we don't necessarily need, or there are alternative materials that we can perhaps use in certain applications, but plastic is an incredible material. All we just have to do is make sure that we can manage it better, and you know, we gain a lot of efficiencies in that area as well. But we're seeing businesses, you know, seeing benefits hitting the bottom line in terms of savings and things that they're discovering through this journey, and I think that reinforces it even further and encourages them to even be more creative. But it is about that, that management side of things. So yeah, clever brains thinking in that sort of space. The other one I was going to talk about was the compostable side of things, which we've touched on. I think, you know, there's an innovation there. The advice is always just be informed around these things, because people are hearing great stories, but it's not necessarily reflective of the situation here in Australia. I talk about the difference between, you know, technical recyclability, in theory it can be recycled, but if we don't have the processing capacity, if we don't have the end market for the material here, businesses aren't going to try and reprocess and recover this stuff if there's no business model behind it. So they're the sorts of nuances that APCO, I think, can help with in that sort of situation. But it's about being informed and understanding, I guess, the full picture of the decisions that you're making in order to be making the right ones for the world in which we're living in. So yeah, I think it's moving really fast. It's hard to say what the key innovations are. I think that's probably the biggest challenge at the moment.
Yeah,
tricky to keep up with it.
Yeah, but what I've heard throughout the webinar so far, Jane, is that APCO is working really hard to just simplify the whole circular loop. Make it easy for businesses and consumers to do the right thing to keep it circulating. There's a real opportunity for businesses to help by promoting the ARL and promoting the great things they're doing. Then you're saying that potentially there's the chance for them to innovate and actually do some things quite innovatively, which that leads to strategic competitiveness, doesn't it? Like if you can innovate, because environmental is a hot topic for most people out there at the moment. Like it's number 1 or 2. When I talk to businesses, it is up there in number 1 or number 2. I rarely hear saying it's not there. It's not number 3 or 4 on their list of priorities. And then the other part, I guess, is it's about innovating, like continuous improvement. What can we do to innovate and simplify things, but also maybe do things that's going to give our consumers a better experience?
Actually, that's another, we've kind of broadened our focus a little bit in that respect as well. I think APCO really is primarily there to assist businesses to meet their compliance obligations and support that process. So we're not prescriptive as such. We are really just reflective of what's going on in the marketplace so that people can make decisions that are appropriate to the systems that we're operating within. On that other side of the innovation argument, we've recently just launched the Australian, New Zealand and Pacific Plastics Pact, which is a partnership with Ellen MacArthur Foundation and WRAP in the UK, who started up with the UK Plastics Pact back in 2016, I think it was. So we've become the administrator for the regional Australian, New Zealand, Pacific Plastics Pact. So that very much is an innovation space, and working with people like Ellen MacArthur, ultimately it's a place to be having those conversations about how we can, I guess, watch this evolution and help drive and I guess shape the evolution of what we need to see in the market as we go into the future. So that gives us the opportunity to be looking at some of these more creative spaces over here with the EMF side of things, but also still working closely with businesses to make sure that they're comfortable in the situation that we're in at the moment. So 2 prongs.
Yeah, Jenna. Yeah, it's amazing because the thing that I saw originally in my career when it came to environmental causes, everyone saw that there was a win-lose. The environment wins, but business loses. There's an economic loss. But that's not the case, is it? Like there is a clear win-win between environmental and business economic gains. And I think more companies are becoming aware of that now, that we can actually do efforts that's going to help the planet and help societies for the future, but also get economic gains at the same time. And I think Ellen MacArthur and her foundation and the work Ken Webster's done and everyone has proven that, because it's actually come from that foundation of green economics.
That's it. And if there wasn't an economic benefit, I still don't think many businesses would have taken this challenge on. And I think that's been a pleasant surprise for a lot of them, that there are triple bottom line kind of results that are coming across the board here. And from a consumer perspective, the kind of demand that consumers are articulating in this space, it's driving businesses that have got big budgets to move forward very quickly, but they're also setting the landscape for other businesses to follow rapidly behind. So we've got, thinking about things like, pigmentations. We've got this issue with carbon black pigmentations in packaging that can't be detected in material recovery facilities because it just basically makes the material invisible to the detection systems. Unilever, for example, has gone and developed a new pigment which enables them to keep the black, but it allows it to go through and be detected in a material recovery facility. So the recyclability of that packaging has just been magnified for their own ranges, but they've also made that technology available publicly. So any business that wants to take on that approach can do the same thing. So we're seeing that kind of knock-on effect as well, that I think that there is such a drive to change the space that the benefits are actually starting to roll out and benefit everybody.
Oh yeah, Jane, and Unilever is one of the leaders, and you look at what's happening with their business at the minute, they're going through the roof. So
Absolutely.
it's a case in point of that economic and planetary outcomes. It's amazing. Jane, thank you so much for sharing those innovations and the answers to the questions that Aussie businesses have had. I really appreciate it. Before we finish up, Jane, if attendees want to be able to learn more, do more, how can they reach out and connect with APCO?
Yeah, sure. Look, we've got this beautiful brand spanking new website that we just we relaunched our old one with a very lovely new face on it. The website is I think it's on screen there. It's just apco.org.au is our address. We've got a wealth of information up there that is open, publicly available to everybody to start their journey in this process. It talks as well a lot about the covenant and what the compliance obligations there are around the regulation that exists. That regulation is actually under review again at the moment, and we understand from the kind of consultation process that was undertaken a few months ago that there's a strong and growing appetite for increased focus in this area. So we feel that government's likely to come out towards the end of the year with something that I guess strengthens the regulation. Pure speculation on my part. I'm just, that's my hearsay that I'm hearing around the traps that might be the case. So there's a lot of information up there about that. There's also things like the sustainable packaging guidelines. There are a lot of case studies that people can access. There are a lot of the resources that I've talked about today are publicly available as well. So hop on there and do a bit of a search if you're looking for things like recycled content or action plan on single-use plastics or compostables. You can type it into the search engine and it will throw up a bunch of resources that people can use, videos and things as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Jane. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic.
I'll hand back over. Thanks, Prue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brad and Jane. Honestly, those insights were truly invaluable. And just a quick note to what Jane was mentioning at the end there, we do have 5 of the key handouts that Jane has spoken about during the presentation available for our attendees to download. So they should just be there on your screen if you'd like to take them from today's session. We do have a little tiny bit of time to answer some quick questions that have come through. So we will start off with a question that we got for you, Jane, from Fiona, and she wanted to know, is APCO only required if you're government owned? And I guess as an extension on that, how could you join APCO?
Great question. No, Prue, we are actually, we're a member organisation, we're a not-for-profit. Businesses that are obligated under the National Environment Protection Measure are any businesses that use or put packaging into the Australian marketplace. So private, public, anybody that is actually putting packaging on the market has an obligation under the National Environment Protection Measure. APCO provides a voluntary framework in which to meet those compliance obligations. So we have memberships predominantly with what we call brand owners. So they are the people that are putting the packaging into the market and are the ones that are obliged under the regulation. And we have a sliding scale of membership fees that starts from businesses under $5 million of turnover a year can join us for $500, and it goes all the way up from there. So it's not a particularly onerous membership fee, but it gives you access to one-stop shop for things like reporting, action planning, gives you access to the Australasian Recycling Label and the PREP tool. So some good benefits associated with joining APCO as a voluntary member.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that one, Jane. And just wary of time, we will probably just do one last question. And this one is from Gail. Her question is, our company would like to not use single-use plastic in the future. We're currently using it to protect our products from scratching. Is there anything out there that you see could be a replacement?
Without understanding what the product is, that's a bit of a hard question. I guess yes. I mean, there are a lot of alternatives out there. I think one of the things to think about though is, again, if there is a recovery process in place for the materials that you are using, labeling is a really valuable way of being able to keep that. It gives you a license to keep that material in the system, because if it is recyclable and it can be captured through an existing system that is operating in the marketplace at the moment, then that material will be recovered and go back in and circulate around more than once. So ultimately it doesn't become a single-use material in that context, because you have got following on subsequent uses for it. So I hope that maybe answers the question a little.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good way to, I guess, pose it back to Gail and other attendees who probably have similar thoughts as to maybe it's not necessarily that they have to find an alternative, but just a better way to
Yeah,
have
I
it
think that's
moving circularly.
Brew, one thing I find listeners that works is think about where your packaging ends up and how do you make it easy for the person where it ends up? Because that's your biggest trick from turning it from being a linear outcome to where it ends up in the landfill to turning it into a circular outcome. Because if you make it easy for where it ends up, you've got your best chance of it becoming circular.
absolutely.
Absolutely.
And that's certainly the kind of guidance that we offer is certainly focused on exactly that. We understand where it is potentially going to go and try and advise people as to how they design things best so that it will go there.
Fantastic. Well, that does bring us to the end of our time today. So a big thank you again to our presenters for joining us, as well as all of our fabulous attendees and some of the questions that we had coming through. We will email everyone the webinar recording along with the helpful resources that Jane has mentioned today and a few others in the next few days for you, so you can gain some further knowledge and help around this topic and perhaps get started on more of that sustainable packaging journey. We do ask our attendees to stay on just for a moment longer to answer a short feedback survey. We're always trying to make sure that this is the most informative and valuable series possible, and we really need your feedback to help us to achieve that. So again, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and stay in good health. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much everybody for
Thank
having
you,
us.
everyone.